folks, Dave here at Thunder Mesa Studio on a Workbench Wednesday, and I hope you're having a great day wherever you are and whenever you happen to be watching this. Today I want to go into detail on the topic of, well, detail. From time to time on these Workbench Wednesdays, I like to dive into the why of model making and, not just the how, with discussions on the larger creative concepts that make things work or not. And today I want to explore something known as the detail threshold and how understanding it can actually lead to better models. In a nutshell, the detail threshold refers to the line, the sweet spot, where there's enough detail in the model to make it convincing, to make it believable, to get the story across, but not so much that it becomes visual clutter. And to further complicate things, this line moves around depending on what scale you're modeling. A comment that I sometimes get on my modeling is that the models are well detailed, even super detailed. And if that's a comment that you have made, thank you very much. But I would argue that they may not be quite as detailed as you think. In fact, I like to think that they're just detailed enough. Of course, we're all going to have different opinions about, how much is enough detail and how much is too much. But there are a few things which are universally true. And to understand those things, we kind of have to zoom out from the world of model making and examine the world of human perception. That might seem like an esoteric topic for a model railroading channel, but trust me, it's all going to make sense in the end. Regardless of what scale you model in, all of our models are designed, built to be experienced, to be perceived by full-size 1:1 scale humans. So understanding how we perceive things can actually lead to better model making. Not to mention a better understanding of our fellow human beings. Oh, before we continue, a quick content warning. If you are, say, a flat earther or a young earth creationist or a believer in ancient aliens or anyone really who might find themselves offended by a discussion on the scientific basis for human perception, I highly recommend that you skip ahead to this timestamp here where I circle back around to model trains because, I'm not here to attack anyone's belief or to argue with anybody. Now, where was I? If there's one thing that evolutionary biologists, psychologists, and Buddhists can all agree on, is that the world that we perceive is not always an accurate picture of the world that's really out there. The truth is our brains are constantly manufacturing the world that we perceive from the limited data provided by our senses, filtered through our memories of past experiences, which, by the way, were also manufactured from incomplete data, and so on. So, objectively speaking, our perception of reality is never 100% accurate. But over the millennia, it's been good enough for us to survive, even thrive on this rock out in space, long enough to pass on our DNA to the next generation. That's what's meant by survival of the fittest, by the way. It's not the best, just good enough to work. We are able to do this because of a particular human superpower known as pattern recognition. The human brain is basically a pattern-making, organizing, and recognizing machine. We are truly great at this, far better than any other species on the planet as far as we can tell. And this single amazing ability has allowed us to skip right to the top of the food chain. Along the way, inventing things like mathematics, language, music, machines, art, and yes, even model trains. And model trains are, I'm sure, what you tuned in to hear more about, not necessarily a discourse on human perception. But the two are related, trust me. And if you've come along with me this far and haven't skipped ahead, please allow me just one more digression, and I promise it'll all come together and make sense in the end regarding the topic at hand. Say you're an early human, walking along the savannah in Africa, minding your own business, when you suddenly hear and see a rustling in the grass nearby. Now, your pattern recognizing brain is going to give you a couple of different options. One is that it's just the wind in the grass, nothing to worry about. But another option is it might just be a lion who's looking to eat you. Now, statistically, more often than not, it's probably just the wind. But importantly, the wind in the grass is not going to eat you. And that means there's not much survival benefit in believing that the pattern you just witnessed was the wind, even though that's more likely to be true. One time out of 100, it's going to be the lion. And so the caveman that believes that it's a lion in the grass is more likely to survive and pass on their DNA to the next generation. And so it goes on and on down through the years. You see, not perfect, just good enough. The ability to recognize and imagine patterns, even when no real pattern is present, explains many, many things, like why we see animal shapes in the clouds, or faces in rock formations, or even hidden Mickeys where none are intended. It also explains how we can, unfortunately, believe in so many things that aren't actually true. But on the plus side, it also explains a lot about art, like how we can look at splotches of color on a flat canvas and have them resolve in our minds into an image that we understand as a representation of something from the real world. This is an ability that we all take for granted, but the visual arts could not exist without it. It's kind of wild when you think about it. Impressionism probably offers one of the best examples of this, like when we look at a Monet painting with its loose, visible brushstrokes, open composition, and depiction of light. Our pattern-recognizing brain organizes this limited information into an idea that says water lilies, even though no actual water lilies are present. The early Impressionists like Monet could be said to be working right on the outer edge of the detail threshold, giving just enough visual information, usually through the use of light, to imply what the painting was meant to represent. Conversely, the latter modern school of abstract expressionism left detail behind almost completely, making no attempt at realistic representation. Naturally then, when faced with these works, our brains are free to find abstract patterns within them which the artist may never have intended. And from here, it's just a short hop, skip, and a jump from the world of art back to the world of model making. It's doubtful that anyone would want to create an abstract expressionist model railroad, since representations of the real world are kind of our thing. But understanding these artistic movements and how they work on the human consciousness can help to inform us about how detail matters in our own work and where that detail threshold actually is. But if you do make an abstract expressionist model railroad, I want to see it. So, back to model making. If you skipped over all of that last part, welcome back. But you missed some pretty good stuff. When making models, that detail threshold can also be thought of as the line of believability. On one side of that line, there's enough of the right details in the right places to allow the viewer to see it as a believable representation of whatever it's supposed to be. On the other side of that line, not so much. The lack of the correct details will make the model unconvincing. It might seem unfinished, toy-like, or in the worst case, unintelligible. But how to find that line? Luckily, as modelers, we are usually basing our models on full-size things from the real world. So a big part of the answer is research. Find out as much as you can about the thing you're modeling and then add the details that will fit. The correct details, that is. This is important. If you're telling a story with your models, and we are all storytellers, the correct details matter. I call this informed detail. The stuff you add needs to make sense with what the thing is, where it is, and when it is. Just throwing a wad of detail castings at a model is not really good enough, though we've probably all been guilty of this. For a truly excellent model, the detailing needs to be informed by research and fit the era, age, function, and location. Yes, even if it's a fantasy model, the fantasy needs to make sense with its own internal logic, with details that seem like they come from a real, living, breathing world. But making fantasy models seem realistic is a big topic and probably deserves a whole other video. In fact, I think I'll jot that idea down for later. But on the flip side of the coin, how much detail is too much? You know, it might be tempting to say that you can never put too much detail into a model, but that hasn't really been my experience. Remember that human talent for pattern recognition? This is where it helps your modeling. When enough information is present, our mind completes the picture and fills in the rest, just like with a Monet painting. Use this to your advantage. Lavish details where they're going to show, and the viewer's mind will fill in the blanks and assume the rest of the model is just as detailed as what they can easily see. Over-detailed models or wrongly detailed models can lead to visual clutter. Too much junk everywhere or the wrong junk will cause people's perception to just skim off the surface. It can be overwhelming and leave the viewer with no solid place to focus their attention on. In other words, visual clutter can cause disinterest and even discomfort, and that doesn't really help you get your story across. A lot of the AI generated art I've seen is guilty of this. There's just too much going on. Every hair and wrinkle is rendered, and human beings just don't perceive reality that way. It's visually cluttered and can be disquieting and even disturbing as a result. And that's not even mentioning the extra fingers. So do the research. Choose details that tell the story of the era, age, function, and location of the model, and try to avoid too much visual clutter. Trust the perception of the viewer to help fill in the blanks, because their mind will recognize the patterns and resolve those bits of plastic, wood, and metal into objects that fit the narrative. And this brings us to the topic of scale and how the detail threshold changes in response to it. Imagine yourself in a slow, low-flying airplane looking down on a railroad yard. How much detail would you really be able to make out? You're going to see some indistinct shapes, some splotches of color, some light and shadow. Again, your pattern recognizing brain is going to help resolve these visual clues into objects that you recognize, like crates and barrels on a platform and lettering on a boxcar. And this is roughly what your perspective is when looking at an N-scale model. Now imagine you're closer, maybe standing on the roof of a 3-story building. The details you see are going to appear more distinct, and you're probably going to see more of them. Smaller objects at greater distance might still look like blobs of color, light and shadow, but that just gives more depth to the scene. This is roughly your perspective in a scale like HO. Closer still, looking from the roof of a 1-story building, or maybe even the top of a boxcar, you're going to see much more detail, and it's going to be much sharper and more distinct. You might be able to, read the labels on the crates, or even see the rabbit hiding in the bushes trackside. This is what the larger scales like O have to offer. In a scale like FN3, roughly 1/20th, you might be standing trackside and be able to make out the labels on the rusty tin cans down in the ditch. The point here is that when talking about levels of detail, scale can be thought of as the viewing distance from the object. The smaller a scale is, the farther away and less distinct details in that scale are going to appear. Thinking about it this way can really inform our modeling and give a much more solid idea of where the detail threshold lies. If you're detailing an N-scale scene, it's easy to imagine flying over in a low-flying plane, and that's going to give you a lot of information on what to leave in and what to leave out. For example, would it really be worth the time to add nail holes and labels to the crates when that really wouldn't be visible at that distance? You'd probably be much better off focusing on the larger picture. But modeling a foreground structure in 1/48 scale, yeah, you're probably going to want to add those nail holes and print some tiny labels for the crates, because this is a much closer view and those details are going to be much more discernible. Simple shapes and blobs of color aren't really going to do the job, at least not in the foreground. The background's another story where, simple shapes and colors can be perceived as objects that are farther away. Let me give you an example. The sides of this combination car are actually made from layers of printed paper. This is not painted wood. This is a technique that I use often because it works well in ON30. At this scale, Our pattern recognizing brains tell our eyeballs that this is actually wood siding. But it's not a technique I would attempt in a scale like, say, FN3, because that closer view would make it less convincing. It would probably give away the trick. And that, my friends, is the detail threshold. So, to review, scale can be thought of as viewing distance from the object. The closer to full size a model is, the more numerous and sharply focused those foreground details need to be. The human gift of pattern recognition will help resolve small and indistinct details into things our brains can understand, and we can use that to our advantage. In the smaller scales, basic shapes and blobs of color will be perceived as detail objects. And in the larger scales, those same shapes and colors will be perceived as objects that are farther away. The most important takeaway here is that everything we model is relative to the perception of the viewer. Our models, after all, are made to be enjoyed by full-size humans. And that's a point I think that sometimes gets overlooked in discussions about detail and scale and the presentation of our models in general. Don't forget the viewer, folks. But what do you viewers think? I hope you'll let me know in the comments down below and give me your ideas on the detail threshold. Thanks for watching, everybody. I hope you enjoyed this discussion today and hope you got something good out of it. If you did, please like, subscribe, share, and hit that notification bell so YouTube will let you know when the next video is coming from Thunder Mesa Studio. You can also follow over on Instagram at thunder.mesa and check out the resources available at the Thunder Mesa Studio website at thundermesa.studio. As always, a huge shout out and thank you to our Patreon members who help to make these videos possible. Until next time, keep moving forward, my friends. Adios for now.